Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This week's episode is a really interesting one. I am joined by the industrial designer, educator, and author Bruce Tharp. Bruce is an associate professor at the Stamp School of Art and Design in Michigan and runs the creative studio Materiality with his wife Stephanie. Bruce has this really interesting background. He originally studied mechanical engineering and then went to graduate school at the Pratt Institute, where he studied industrial design before going to the University of Chicago to get his PhD in Sociocultural Anthropology. Bruce and Stephanie recently published this massive new book for MIT Press called Discursive Design, where they are seeking to legitimize and problematize what they are kind of defining as this new field or area of design practice that they're calling discursive design. And that's really where this episode begins. I was curious to talk to Bruce about discursive design and what that is and how it's different than, say, something like critical design or speculative design. So we talk about the book and their goals for pushing for this new type of work, as well as Bruce's own background as both a designer and an anthropologist and how that's influenced his current research and sort of the roles of writing and research and design and how they all kind of fit together. This was such a fascinating conversation. Sometimes I think the most interesting episodes of the podcast are the ones where I'm talking to someone who's working in a field that I have very little knowledge about. And this felt like one of those. I feel like I learned a lot and we got into some really interesting discussions. So I hope that you like it and really encourage you to pick up the new book. It's really, really interesting. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that goes out at the beginning of every month and expands on the themes of the podcast, previews the upcoming episodes, and shares relevant and interesting links and stories about design and criticism and writing and all of the things that we're interested in here. These memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy my conversation with Bruce Tharp. I kind of just want to start with the big question, I guess. What is discursive design?
Yeah, discursive design, we kind of have a formal definition of it. But really, so the term discursive comes from the word discourse. And by discourse, we're really using the idea of systems of thought or knowledge as sort of our working definition of discourse. And really, this is the use of artifacts, and artifacts we can begin to understand that very, very broadly from services systems. And so the use of artifacts to embody or engender these kind of discourses, these ideas that are what we call substantive, and that that means that we use psychological, sociological, and they have ideological import. So they're not just any theme or simple idea, but that they're fundamentally debatable and contestable. There's competing narratives going on, and so this leaves them in the realm of the sociocultural, really, these kind of big topics and issues that we discuss and debate every day in lots of different ways, whether implicitly or explicitly.
I feel like, we were talking before we kind of hit record that I come from a graphic design background, and there are all these kind of sub-design modes or processes that are springing up all the time. There's critical design and speculative design and design fiction and strategic design. And in your book, you kind of talk about a couple of those and how those relate. Can you talk about how maybe either how discursive design is different than those, or kind of what sets it apart, or maybe even kind of putting it into some sort of trajectory of like how those fit together? You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And the language is really important, and one of the things that we struggled with as well. So we were exposed to this arena under the banner of critical design. Certainly, when we were in grad school, Stephanie and myself, she was at RISD and I was at Pratt, and so, conceptual design is really what people were, sort of framed this as. And then I think that with Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby,
Yeah.
and the introduction of with Hertzian Tales in 1999, the work that was done from his PhD dissertation at the RCA, that this sort of really sparked something special. And I started teaching not too long after that, and so critical design certainly came up as something that was helpful or useful for our students, in sort of opening them up to the idea of an expanded mode, or expanded notion of what design is and could be. But it's sort of very quickly we run up against some of the limitations of critical design, and one of those being its relation to critical theory and the and inherent criticisms, actually, of critical theory in terms of enlightenment and emancipation. Right? If we take those as two of those key aspects of critical theory, that we're going to enlighten and emancipate others from these sort of structures of power that they may not be aware of, and we're sort of liberating in a way, right? That comes with sort of an elitist critique comes along with it. I know, and you won't know. So that was part of it, and also just the issue. So that's sort of on a higher, more theoretical, scholarly level, and sort of even on the ground a little bit. The notion of critical and criticizing being sort of negative, and sort of a negative perspective on this from almost a more colloquial way. And we also began to look at where there is something even broader than criticism and criticality. So the idea of discursiveness and discourse became what we felt more useful. And so we started to think about what that could possibly be. We were actually really reticent, and so we knew right away that we wanted to begin to build on this area, to begin to help our students who wanted to do this kind of work. And that's, I think, one of the things that's unique about our book, is that we're really focusing on tools and languages and processes and frameworks that help designers do this kind of work. So we're really beginning to focus on that aspect of it. And we actually were very reticent about introducing a new term for this. It's like, oh my gosh, So we're really, for a long time, we really kind of clung to critical design up until the point we just felt we couldn't sort of hold on anymore to this, and where discourse began to be more relevant. And so the way we position this is, so we use what we call a sort of a genus and species analogy. So the idea is discursive design is the genus, and within that genus there are all these other species like critical design, adversarial design, design fiction, speculative design, some more historic and some that are sort of on the cusp, and even maybe fairly esoteric. But for us, we didn't want to get sort of bogged down in a relatively new field with some of the language. In fact, with all of the research, the interviews that we did with work, it was very clear that designers are sort of uncomfortable with like how they begin to name and call and identify, and it was almost funny. I always hated asking the question, and a lot of them just sort of gave, like, oh, whatever, it's critical it doesn't really matter, and so that's and we've been finding more and more people sort of adopting discursive as a way to remove from some of these sort of individual definitions that are sort of completely normal and natural for a young field. So I think it'll work itself out, and people will be able to distinguish. Perhaps I think, what's the difference between speculative design and design fiction, for example? I mean, some people sort of consider design fiction really a subcategory of speculative design. So these things are going to work, they'll work themselves out. And in a way, we're less concerned about the labeling of this and more concerned about like how to begin to do this kind of work, however you may want to define it. Because I think there is something to the distinctions between them, that there is, I would say, something a little bit more distinctive of design fiction than speculative design. And that's probably the use of narrative.
Right. Oh, I
But
see.
it's
Yeah.
completely fine. The analogy that I often use is of music. There are literally tens of thousands of subgenres of music. There's a website that I think it's everynoise.com or everynoise.org that basically is looking at identifying these subgenres. And
Right.
and I think that's completely fine. It can be a little bit difficult, right, to navigate, of course, but the idea that there are distinctions, and these can be very meaningful distinctions for the people who are doing the work. And I don't feel like I should say that your distinction that you find meaningful, saying that that's not relevant or important or valuable. So I think it's a natural consequence, and I'm excited to see more development, and I think along with more development, more types of projects and different emphases, that we'll find more language that becomes more appropriate. So I think the list of types of design that are beneath this sort of rubric or underneath the umbrella of discursive design, I think it's going to continue to grow. At least for a while, and I think then there may be some consolidation. But fundamentally, we're less concerned with the naming game than we are sort of how to work with, in our cases as academics, students,
Right.
and other designers who want to do this kind of work.
Yeah, I have like like three or four different questions that I want to kind of pull out of what you just
Okay,
said,
good.
because I think I think there's something really interesting here, and I'm going to try to formulate some sort of coherent uh, way to talk about this. So I totally see the influence of Dunn and Raby, and I think, just kind of side note, I think Hertzian Tales is lesser known of their work, but kind of way more interesting in a lot of ways. I think there's a lot to that, and it always is speculative. Everything is the one that kind of everyone knows for them. So I love that you brought that one up. But what's interesting, or what I want to try to maybe articulate a little bit, is that I think you're right that there's a certain narrativity to speculative design or design fiction, and I think people like Dunn and Raby, or kind of even more in the graphic design side, people like Metahaven
Yeah.
tend to work in more art contexts, or in kind of, it's removed from the market, I guess, is kind of what I'm thinking
Yeah.
about. And what's interesting to me potentially about discursive design, there's a line in the book that I really loved where you said, artifacts and their consumption allow the social to be made visible.
Mhm.
And I think including consumption in there is kind of really important. And it reminds me of something that comes up on this podcast all the time, that I kind of think of design as ideologies made artifact. It's kind of taking these ideas and turning them into objects.
Mhm.
And so I guess my two questions are is could you talk about kind of discursive design as it relates to consumption, or to the market, or to the kind of commercial side of design? And then secondly, and this may or may not be related, so I'm sorry to just kind of throw all of this at you at once. I'm hearing you say this, I'm almost wondering if all design is kind of a discursive design.
Right. Okay. Yes. Well, I would say answer the second one
Okay.
first, and I'll probably have to have you remind me of the first one.
Okay.
Yes, I think certainly it can be. I mean, so the way we distinguish discursive design is the goal is reflection. So we're
Mm,
using the artifact to get people to reflect on these discourses. So they're embodied and engendered through these artifacts, and that's the not the ultimate goal, but sort of the at least the first goal that we're shooting for. So this is an intellectual engagement as opposed to one that's necessarily utilitarian. Right.
right.
So absolutely, all designs can be discursive. I think part of the question is the degree to which that is intentional or not. Certainly, and
Mm,
the social sciences, look at this in great depth. We look at the power of all discourses that are in all kinds of objects around us. So again, explicit, implicit, often implicit. So yes, anything can be discursive in this way. For us, the question is the degree to which it's intentionally discursive. And
Oh,
it's something that especially product designers have had sort of less, it's been a little less legitimate to use a commercial product as a mode or industrial design practice as a mode for that type of reflection. And I'm not
Right.
really sure why. Architecture has had it, graphic design has had it, fashion design. So, but for some reason, product design has sort of been left out of that permission. And I think that was what was so fantastic about what Dunn and Raby have done is they sort of hit it right and really got people to begin to think about product designers about the possibility for doing that kind of work. And so it really helped with the legitimacy of it. So for me, that's one of the things we also talk about is in terms of relationship with sort of mass markets and sort of typical or traditional product design or industrial design is that you have certain constraints you're working underneath, right? If you're working within a marketplace, those are given constraints. So does it mean that you can't have there's no discourse or discursiveness there? I would say no. It just becomes a little bit more constrained. It's a little harder to do that. And it's also a little more challenging in a commercial context because people don't expect their commercial products to necessarily have a kind of discourse that's embedded in them. Yeah, certainly they can add that to them and they can appropriate them in those ways, but we don't necessarily expect it. So there's a little bit of a challenge there, but absolutely. And we encourage our students who are interested in discursive design, but also are interested in commercial design to think about how they may begin to bring those together. And when we often talk about, and actually one of the ways of framing this, and this is in the book as well, we talk about these sort of 4 fields or 4 types of design or 4 agendas for design: the commercial, the responsible, experimental, and the discursive. And with those, that one of the things is that they're not discrete categories, but they're really agendas, and we can begin to combine those agendas. And so a lot of times, if you're a commercial designer, but you really want to have this kind of voice and that discursive design has, then you think about how you might bring an element of discursiveness within, a different type of project. In fact, some people even think that in a way, like all responsible design projects are fundamentally discursive because of the context. You think of them, this responsible design, which is more philanthropic or altruistic, and for example, you're working in Uganda on solar cookers or something like that. That in and of itself is very discursive. You're getting people. The existence of that product gets people to reflect on their own, and largely the others we're talking about are sort of people that are more privileged in sort of the global north, and it gets to begin to reflect on your sort of privilege and that you have working there. So I would say yes, all of these can be discursive, and we're interested in potentially how we might begin to blend these a little bit, these agendas.
I teach graduate students in graphic design in a program at Pratt, actually, that's very research heavy, and there is a emphasis on using these kind of what I'm going to call alternative modes of design: critical design, speculative design. I think discursive design clearly kind of fits into this, and I always feel a little bit guilty or a little bit weird. I always have a group of students that are like, this is really interesting, but I also need to get a job after this. And I want to, this might just be me just asking you for teaching advice at this point. I kind of wanted to show them that these kind of alternative modes of practice can filter into other more commercial context. And I'm someone who's more on the academic side, but I also feel a certain responsibility to my students of kind of how can you kind of start to blend these together a little bit.
Right. Well, so this is one of, actually, in going back a little bit, where this all started for us, and where we were coming up against some of the limitations of critical design, at least how Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby were discussing it. It was really it was pitted against the market, right? There was affirmative design, and then there was critical design, and it was very explicit that this type of design could not exist in the marketplace.
Right.
That was for a little. I don't know if it's the final straw, but it was really a big part because we saw the potential for it in a commercial context potentially.
Right.
And of course, that comes along with all kinds of limitations, like I was mentioning before. Right? There's limitations when you're working in the marketplace, things that you can't do, people don't expect. But it doesn't mean that there's not value there. And so it is a bit of a compromise from maybe sort of a pure application of that. But it still has value. It could still reach. In some ways, many, many, many more people than you could with, a critical design exhibition, that's attended by maybe a couple hundred people that all were sort of, thinking the same way anyway, right? It's not necessarily the audience you want to attend to. And I think in general, the field is sort of has recognized that a little bit. So the idea of the commercial was always something for us where we found potential, and still there folks within this within these area that still sort of see that distinction as that it cannot exist there. But for our argument is that it absolutely can. So I think for students that completely get where you're coming from, it's something that we and the other academics are in that space as well. Everyone's sort of having to deal with that question. And so, like I was mentioning before, is that I think you can bring discursiveness into a commercial practice. I think it's possible. Not necessarily always easy, and it comes with compromises, but I think it's possible. I do also think that it's important, if I'm doing my job as a design professor, that I want to expose students to the breadth of what the field offers.
Exactly.
And it's not just commercial. So for me, just on a basic level, I feel I'm being responsible by exposing them to the possibilities that are out there. So not necessarily with the expectation that they're going to use it, but they're going to at least be able to put what they want to do out of what they want from design, what agendas they bring design, that they can put those into context and understand that there are other ones that are out there and available to them. I do think so. One, I think that there are certainly more opportunities now than ever to do discursive kind of work within institutions. So it's still admittedly very, very small, but we've got great examples out there with the Situation Lab, Near Future Laboratory, Extrapolation Factories, Superflux. So there are a number of smaller firms that are working in this space. And so I think there is the possibility of doing that. There's also the possibility, and this is sort of maybe the most viable for a lot of sort of young designers, is that they have a commercial day job, and this is the kind of work they may do on the side. That's still, if you're really interested in this kind of work and you believe in these discourses and you want to have sort of impact on people's, what they're thinking a little bit, that, as a designer, you want to participate more deeply in society in this way, that you can do this stuff on the side. So I think that's definitely the lowest hanging fruit. I also think that, one of the ways I think that discursive design is sort of benefiting is from the field of strategic foresight and its relationship to speculative design. So we're seeing more and more, and they tend to be larger companies that have a budget for strategic foresight. They are investing in the tools, mostly of speculative design in that arena. So that's helping to propel the field forward a little bit. And for me, I see a lot of parallels, and we write a little bit in the book about this with design research. So I was around when design research in the United States was not really a thing, and not necessarily even respected that much. In fact, it was even
Right.
seen as antithetical to design.
Right.
When
Right.
I left Pratt to pursue a PhD in cultural anthropology, I had people at Pratt saying, "Well, after you've done your PhD, don't come back here and tell me what I need to design."
Huh.
The idea that research was basically, trammeling or stifling creativity, right? And so it's completely different now. That way, in fact, I think the pendulum might actually have swung, too far to the other side. But there was that issue was absolutely there with design. So I see some parallels between where how discursive design is sort of maturing, and and with design research, really, I think that the web and the influx or the demand, with the information age, where we basically have computational devices, and we start to need to begin to understand how people are using these very new and different forms and interfaces, that actually helped propel design research a great deal. So there was this really a business need for this kind of work, design research work. And I see, strategic foresight operating in the same kind of way with the field in general. It's helping to propel it forward a little bit. And I guess the last thing that I think can be powerful for young designers, or actually any designer who wants to do this kind of work, is crowdfunding. And this sort of wasn't around when we were first sort of kicking around, some of the possibilities for how this, like how designers might do this work.
Yeah.
But it really, a lot of the limitations. So you have advantages to the mass marketplace generally because it's mass. You get more people who are able to are exposed to your work. The disadvantage of that is that you don't have full control of the messaging. Largely because we're
Right.
working through manufacturers and distributors who may not want to be seen as too provocative. So you don't have control.
Right. Yeah.
You don't have control of the message. However, with Kickstarter, for example, or any crowdfunding platform, you get the advantages of the platform and more eyeballs and ears sort of hearing and seeing what you're doing, but you also control the messaging on that. So it's, for me, I'm really excited about the possibility of crowdfunding platforms for this field in a way that allows designers to do more work and do it differently and perhaps better. Actually get
Right.
these things in people's hands potentially, although I still think it can be, it can be used the same way as almost like the way marketing, you use Kickstarter for marketing
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
so than the
Yeah.
actual
Yeah.
thing, that it can be used that way. But the fact that you can help, that platform can actually help people get discursive artifacts in their lives and get that interaction and experience, I think is really incredible. And I think it is possible that designers may be able to have careers the way commercial designers now have careers on Kickstarter, where they basically do
Right.
2 or 3
Right.
projects a year. And there's some really great examples of people who left corporate America to as a designer and are now independent and do 1, 2, 3 Kickstarter campaigns a year and make an equivalent amount that they were when they were a corporate product designer. So
Right.
I see that possible because we already see it in this other arena. I don't see why discursive design couldn't operate in that same model as a way to make a living.
Right. And what I think is really interesting is, and please correct me if this is a kind of wrong reading or is maybe a little bit different, but when I think of, again, I don't mean to keep kind of drawing comparisons to critical design or speculative design, but I often see those as all about the product or all about the output. And when I read the book and talking to you, I'm getting a sense that discursive design, yes, it's about the product, but it's just as much about the process. And it's just as much about the thinking that kind of goes into the design process. And when you think about it that way, then that can be kind of embedded in any type of design. And again, to kind of think about graphic design, I think about the designers who are kind of very thoughtful in choosing typefaces that carry some sort of additional meaning, or branding systems that can kind of carry larger messages and things like that. That when you kind of build that reflection into the process itself, it changes the product, but that product doesn't have to then be a discursive product, right?
Yeah, and I would say too. I mean, you were talking about the build up to the artifact, and I think one of the big moves now, as the field has matured, is looking at the dissemination. So I think in sort of the early days, where a designer creating an artifact and putting it on a website. That I think there's increasing skepticism, or we see the limitations of that approach. So one of the arguments we make with our students, we make heavily in the book, is that if you really care about these ideas, then you should be thinking much more about the dissemination of these ideas and how to do that.
Right.
And this is an area that's really tough. It's a generally new territory for designers, right? We focus on the artifact, and then in a commercial context, we let other people, marketers,
That's so interesting.
take care of that. But in a way, we're asking designers at least to, if not do that themselves, to collaborate, just like we do in the commercial realm, to collaborate with those who can help you do that. That it's really half the project when you have an artifact. And I think I think Carl DeSalvo in Adversarial Design, which is I would consider sort of the second most substantive, the second book to come out in a very substantive way on this. The idea of assembling publics, that you as a designer have, if you are going to work in this arena, you have the responsibility of also assembling the public to whom or to which you're speaking. And so there's a little bit of I think that's where we're going, and as the field has grown up and is growing up, that we're seeing more and more of an emphasis on this, and something. Well, and to help sort of put a point on this, we talk about audience-centered design more so than user-centered design. So because product designers, especially, we're thinking about user, and it's a slight but important shift to begin to think about the audience here. Certainly the audience has a relationship to use. They can be the user, but the use is not necessary. It's not the ultimate goal, right? If we've defined reflection, that we want to use utility as a way to get people to reflect or have a deeper or a different kind of reflection. So we're using utility for reflection. So it's a different mode, and that's why it's often we think it's tough to do this kind of work, because this is kind of a weird shift that goes on, but we're really, I think, fundamentally focused on the audience if we're thinking about discursiveness.
I want to kind of shift gears a little bit. I would love to talk about your background. You had mentioned that you studied industrial design at Pratt, and then you went to study anthropology. And when I was kind of researching you and preparing for this, I saw you had originally studied mechanical engineering, and then you went to Pratt for industrial design, and then you kind of make this shift over into the anthropology. Can you talk a little bit about that trajectory and kind of what you were thinking as you were kind of moving through that education system?
Yeah, it's not as disparate as one might think. There's definitely a thread through there, but I studied mechanical engineering. My father was an industrial engineer, and so that was something that was familiar to me. I didn't really know. In fact, it's kind of funny. I really didn't know what I wanted to do, and I actually sent out my senior year in high school. I was sending out query letters because I thought I might want to be an optometrist. So it's really kind of funny.
Wow.
Yeah, well, actually, one of those things with like California achievement tests and things like that, they came back and they say, a doctor would be a good profession for you. And I was like, but I hate blood. And so I thought about optometry as a way of thinking, like, okay, well, if the system thinks, being a doctor would be a good fit for me, but I hate blood, well, maybe optometry could be a way. So it's
I love that. Yeah.
When you think about it now. So but in this sort of college, my senior year looking at colleges, I looked to my father, and he was sort of influential in this way, and so we thought that mechanical engineering would be sort of a good, a good fit. But because I was, like many product, I was always, tinkering as a kid, and
Yeah.
making things and inventing things. So it seemed like a pretty good fit. But during when I was doing engineering, it's very quick. It was really interesting for the first year and a half, and after that, it became not as interesting.
Mm.
That the and what I realized is we were moving further and further away from people,
Hmm.
and other issues. It was very technical, which makes complete sense. So there was a degree of the technical aspect that just wasn't resonating with me. So I finished up the engineering degree partially because I had to. I was on an ROTC scholarship, so
Mm.
I went into the military right after my work. So I basically was committed to mechanical engineering. If I
Oh,
wanted
wow.
to, in
Okay.
fact, I think I may have even had to pay the army back if I switched. If I
Wow.
switched, so I was committed, and it was while I was in. I was in the military. I was in Germany, and I was an Army nuclear weapons officer. And while I was there, I thought, okay, well, I'll use this time to help me figure out what I want to do. And it's kind of a funny
Yeah.
story where I had a friend who was also a mechanical engineer who knew that I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and he sent me a photocopy of I think it was Peterson's Guide for Graduate Schools. I don't still know if it's a
Okay.
popular guide. And he photographed a page and mailed it to me, and he had interior design circled on it. And I kind of read it and I was like, nah, that's not quite a fit. But just above it was industrial design. So I
Yeah.
said, "Whoa, that's really interesting." So I spent my time in the military writing every industrial designer and design schools to try and understand if this was a fit. So um,
Huh.
when I got out of the military, then that's when I enrolled at Pratt in their graduate industrial design program, and just
Okay.
absolutely loved it. I mean, it was I
Yeah.
found my home. So it was somewhat stifled
Yeah.
with the military. You can imagine my
Right.
work
Right.
that way. So this is really just sort of extraordinary for me to do that, and I consider myself first and foremost an industrial designer, a product designer, and but at Pratt, especially at this time, which is very artifact based and I would say concerned with aesthetics. They have a long
Mm.
history and
Mm.
tradition of aesthetics with Rowena Reed Costello and that sort of movement. That there was something that was lacking and understanding the social. So we have these artifacts, and as designers, we're able to, we have opinions about them. But this is really before user research was. There wasn't a user research class or anything like that. So it was
Right.
sort of really sort of secondary or tertiary, and then even more so is this issue of the social, not what an individual might think of this, but how do these things exist in a social context. And so I began sort of looking at programs that would allow me to understand artifacts in this way, and it was I had no idea where to go.
Where did that interest even come from? Or like where, I mean, if you were in this program that was kind of really focused on aesthetics, was that, were you kind of like odd man out? How did that?
Yes, maybe in a way, right? I think again, I think that at the time there was, I mean, it was a fairly big program, so you have all kinds
Right.
of different people coming into it. So I don't think I was alone necessarily, but I definitely had a strong sense that there was something lacking there.
Right. Okay.
And
Okay.
and it was for actually a lot of it was sparked by my thesis project. So I did a thesis called "Product and the Soul," and I was really looking at
Mm.
how products might be able to engage in a deeper way with people rather than sort of
Hmm.
utility or as pure aesthetics, right? So I was doing a lot of reading, and that the reading for that really began to led me in some ways to
Oh, I see.
anthropology, material culture, consumption, that kind of reading. And I just realized with my thesis that I've just just scratched the surface of this. It was
Right.
interesting to me, but there was so much more. And so I started looking into PhD programs like science and technology studies and sociology, anthropology, even I was thinking even theology potentially to
Oh, wow.
address
Wow.
some of these things. And in that process, I graduated and I stuck around at Pratt. I was working at Pratt for 2 years, and I used that time partially to plan my next move and to really begin to look at PhD programs of where I could study, and it turned out that the sociocultural anthropologists were the ones that were most open to what I was interested in, and so I feel lucky that the those at the University of Chicago, which is a premier anthropology program, they were able to sort of see sort of a glimmer in what I was interested in, and so they were supportive of my work there. So there, I was really looking at material culture, consumption, the production and consumption of value. And it was all centered around the artifact. So in a way, if we look, I'm moving from, and in this, I guess in a way, moving from object to thing, if we want to sort of invoke some of that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I was looking at basically artifacts and how they're made and manufactured, and then moving on to maybe aesthetics and some issues of usability if we think about product design, and really to this idea with anthropology, understanding these things in much broader contexts, and some of the different values that we begin to we see in this work. So there is that thread of the artifact, but different aspects of the artifact throughout my seemingly disparate educational.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear you kind of talk about it too, because I think if someone were to look at your CV or something, it would almost look like the anthropology was maybe a move away from design or away from being a designer, but it sounds like you were doing that very much with the goal to enrich your design work. That these things were coming together for you in the making. It was not a purely theory and research based interest. It was always coming back to the object and the thing.
Right. In a way, I looked at this the whole time as a detour. In fact, some people laugh like, "Oh, you're going to do a PhD at the University of Chicago as a detour?"
Right.
To really to come back to design. And I really
Right.
was
That's so
looking at it
interesting.
as a way to enrich and come to design with basically the broadest and best understanding that I could.
I'm really interested in that kind of intersection between the theory and the making, and how those things can kind of come together more. And I'm curious what that PhD experience, what did you kind of take away from that has influenced how you think about your role as a designer? How does that even how did the stuff that started there become what is now discursive design, maybe even?
Um, the I was always a little bit of the odd man out in my anthropology program,
Yeah.
in many ways. For example, I was my first day of class. I had never taken an anthropology class in my life, and I'm sitting next to people who had master's degrees in anthropology from Harvard and
Hmm.
Princeton, and so I was very much the sort of an outsider, and
Right.
also the fact that I wanted to in a way I was interested and saw value in applied anthropology, which at that
Right.
time, especially at the University of Chicago, was really seen as almost a kind of prostitution of the field of anthropology. And also I was interested in I was an Americanist. I was interested in anthropology specifically U.S. culture. That's what I wanted, which
Mm.
at that time that was also seen as true anthropologists or serious anthropologists work in other cultures, right? Because you're biased
Mm.
as an
Right.
American. How
Right.
can you study American culture, right? But of course, we bring all these other biases everywhere else, and there's always the joke that when the anthropologist arrives on at the for the first time to do field work, and they're pulling up their boat in the Trobriand Islands. Who are the first people they meet? Well, 3 other anthropologists that are right. So that kind of thing. So I think that the field of anthropology has sort of also become more open to, certainly I think, applied anthropology, and also being an Americanist, for example. So I was my experience there was not typical in any way, and I was sort of had to make it work the whole time. So my study was with the Old Order Amish and in Indiana. So I was really looking at their material culture and consumption. One of the overriding questions that I had from my thesis at Pratt, at Product and the Soul, was what can people get out of stuff, and are there limitations?
Right.
And why are our lives largely oriented around the acquisition and consumption of this stuff? And is it ultimately meaningful? So some of those questions. So I was really interested in societies or cultures that had made shifts in their relationship to material culture. And being interested in America, it kind of left me with 3 opportunities. One was the voluntary simplicity movement. So this was people, let's say, they were who had voluntarily sort of stepped away from sort of conventional mainstream society and took on a different role. And so what's typical is, I was a lawyer and I worked for 15 years. I actually have a lot of money now, and I'm going to go start a farm in Vermont or something like that. So that kind of community, and that's sort of a little bit of an extreme example of that. But so it was one possibility. There's something called the voluntary simplicity movement, and there are problems with that. Is it's not much of a culture and a society. That's what the challenge is in that area. But I thought of as a possibility. The other one was Native Americans with casino wealth, and that's kind of the opposite. In a way, sort of looking at sort of a shift up in material culture, but that had been largely done. There's lots and lots of anthropologists working with Native American communities, and the last one was with the Amish, and I never had thought about it a whole lot because I didn't think I would really be able to get access to it. But the idea with the Amish, especially in 20th, 21st century, is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to make a living farming. And what's happening is they're taking on a lot of communities. They're taking on and are more open to other types of work. And the community in northern Indiana has a very large population of Amish that are working in doing industrial, like manufacturing. A lot. RV capital of the world is in that area, in the United States, I think. And so they make a lot of RVs and things like that. So they're doing piece rate manufacturing work, and because of that, they have greater disposable income, they have greater leisure time, and they have greater exposure to other people who that are non-Amish, that are that have different relationship to material culture. So because of that shift in work, that people's their orientation to material culture had shifted somewhat. And so that is ultimately what I ended up studying, is their production and consumption of value, how their religious values become instantiated in the value that they see in individual artifacts. So I was really that was the sort of overriding question that I was looking at, and also there was this, there was a sustainability question that I had, and I think that a lot of industrial designers feel, and I think all industrial designers should sort of reflect on, is their role in sustainability and their role in mass consumption and some of the dark side of the industry that we're part of. So for me, it was part of looking at the Amish was like, hey, listen, if these people have figured out a way to do this, what might the non-Amish be able to learn from the Amish in this case? And so we're also, wondering about that from a sustainability standpoint. But what I did find is that they are tempted just as much as we are. They have a hankering for stuff just like we do. And actually, and this is, with the threat of eternal damnation for having a hankering for stuff, they still hanker for stuff. So,
Right.
so for me, the pull of 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 material culture is incredibly strong, and I don't think we're going to be able to quell it from the from the desire side necessarily. I think that
Hmm.
at the level of materials and systems that we might be able to make a better impact. But I go back to this. Eternal damnation. If you want this stuff and you use this stuff in your life, and they still want it. Like,
Right.
for me, without that sort of religious, mandate, I'm what do I have? What hope do I have?
Right.
The
Right. Right.
voluntary nature of this is really, really challenging. And this is something that anthropologists have found. Like, we look throughout the world and we see, even in places where there's what we would say, little, the quantity of material culture, still we use artifacts. They're incredibly important
Mhm.
for social distinction and how we begin to construct our worlds and our lives. And so it's really, really, we can't escape the power of stuff.
Right.
So in terms of what I bring to design from that one, actually, I mean, from a very practical standpoint, the idea of user research and the tools of anthropology in user research. So I don't know if I am, but I think it's very likely that I was the first
Yeah.
product designer to ever get a PhD in anthropology. Um, and so I
Mm.
was kind of right there at the time when design research and anthropology and ethnography were being introduced and coming into design. So I kind of brought that expertise into in a very practical way, but in a but
Right.
and I teach design research, for example. So and I sort of bring
Yeah.
anthropology in that way. And then in a less direct way, I'm also bringing in these ideas of the social more broadly into the studio and classrooms when we think about
Mm. Hmm.
how we're designing and who we're designing for and where this stuff lives and what kinds of value are produced from it. And from a discursive design standpoint, it's probably a little less, although in a way, some of the thinking that we did in the book, sort of certainly comes from this material culture and consumption perspective, and how we begin to think about the role of objects in society in ways about that have to do with social construction and issues like that. So it's less direct in that way, but certainly some of the
Right.
ideas and theorists that I was exposed to, they're brought into some of the theorization and thinking about the field of discursive design. But one of the
Yeah.
things I would say too is that one of the things that we're interested in Stephanie and myself, is how the field can even grow. Right, it's relatively young.
Hmm.
If we go back to, if it's 1999 and Hertzian Tales, we've had 2 decades or so of this kind of work, and one of the chapters that we have in the book is about the domains of discursive design. And part of that is sort of where design is operating right now, but also where it could easily
Hmm.
operate.
Right.
And so we're really interested in how this type of work might begin to expand in different ways. And one of those, or a couple of those, are certainly in the research realm within applied research.
Yeah.
And it's being done already. In fact, that was our 4 categories are social engagement, practical application, applied research, and basic research. And basically, we look at social engagement as really where most of the work has been done. And applied research is kind of next, right? We begin to think, and we, like, say, Philips Design with their design probes project a while.
Oh, right.
The
Right.
idea that you're using discursive artifacts to as research tools to understand people's values, beliefs, and attitudes, and then you take that understanding and then you begin to apply it in whatever realm you want, and it could be commercial or whatever. But part of the thing we're also really excited about is the possibility of what we call practical application, how this type of work
Mm.
can
Right.
be directly useful and operative. And it really comes, if we think about um, uh, I think some of the examples like counseling, coaching, therapy, deliberative democracy, that we can see these artifacts as tools in deliberative democracy, for example, to help visualize potential
Right.
futures that we might vote
Right.
on, for example. So the idea can be
Yeah.
used right before a vote. Or in counseling, that we might begin to think about these artifacts as ways to help people to reflect in useful ways. So we're also interested in sort of the how discursive design can be used even more broadly. So we have so certainly discursive design is part of an expanded notion of design itself. And
Right.
our approach to discursive design is even expansive in and of itself, because we include the possibility of the marketplace. We include these different domains beyond just
Right.
sort of very typical social engagement.
I'm interested. You're talking about this idea of kind of expanding notions of design, and you are somebody that works as a designer. You also are a teacher. It seems like writing is something that's very important to your practice. I'm kind of interested in how all of those fit together for you. Like how does kind of being in the classroom or writing a essay or writing this book, how do those things kind of filter back into the design process, or vice versa?
Um, that's a good question. I don't think I could do any one of them. I
Right.
think that
Yeah.
it sounds like a little bit your background as well. Is
Yeah.
that I always knew that I wanted to teach
Oh, okay.
in some capacity. I at Pratt we had the overwhelming. I think we had 48 professors at Pratt when I was there, and only 3 were full-time professors. So the idea of the adjunct
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
professor was something I was very, very familiar with, and I certainly imagined myself sort of in that role at some point. So I didn't necessarily know like when or to what
Right.
degree I would teach, but it turned out that I started doing that full time. But I have always been a maker. So that aspect is always important to me, and for me, I love being an academic because I basically part of the time, my 40 hours a week.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is I have the responsibility of doing work and doing my own research there. So I'm in the classroom, but I'm also doing the research. And as a designer, we I think we have, as a design academic, we have like this luxury of being able to choose in most places. If we want our
Right.
practice to be more, on the making side or more on the sort of academic and writing side. So it's for me, a wonderful freedom to have. So I go back and forth at times where I'm more interested in the making, and then other times where I'm more interested in the writing. And usually the writing for me is I'm not a natural, like I don't naturally write or journal. But for me, it's a way when I write when I feel I need to write and I need to make sense of something.
Yeah.
And it's a
Yeah.
great way to do that. And really, that's the impetus of the book was absolutely. I just left corporate America and began to start teaching for the first time, and had didn't know what I was doing. I understood design, but I'd never taught before. And you're confronted with just dozens and dozens of graduates. At this time, I think my first teaching experience, I was advising 25 graduate students. My first
Oh, wow.
semester. And then sort of faced with how do I begin to articulate the how do I begin to articulate places in design where designers could go. And because I was teaching when I first started teaching, it was the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and they have a very open sort of it's an arts institution as opposed to an engineering and architectural one. And so a
Right.
lot of and I actually maybe half the students I had were MFAs. They weren't even architects, designers,
Oh,
or
interesting.
interior architects. I had MFA students. And so I was just I was right in the middle of trying to make sense of these different approaches to creative and then, ultimately critical practice. And so for me, the book was, and Stephanie, who had this sort of same challenge. We both she went, as I mentioned, she was at RISD with her grad work and I was at Pratt. And both those schools have a more sort of conceptual approach, or can have a more
Yeah.
conceptual approach. Yet we both at the time felt like we weren't given the tools to do conceptual work. It was very much go out there, do something, come back, we'll critique it, and we'll see if that, if it works or doesn't work. And coming from engineering, we were both like, where are the books?
Yeah.
It's going to help me do this. Like, what do you mean? You just want me to go out and make something? And so the book project for us was very much how to begin to make sense and in a way give our students what we didn't get as students, as a little bit more of structure, language, frameworks, approaches for doing this kind of sort of conceptual, critical, discursive work. So for me, the writing is a way to begin to make sense. I write when I feel I need to or have to. But they all, they just work wonderfully together, right? And when you're in a practical profession like design, you need to be a maker, I think, to be good in the classroom and to give good critique and to guide students. I really enjoy and get energized by being in the classroom. So that's wonderful for me. And it also gives me the time in the summers to do my own work. And the writing fits, right along in there. And actually, it's really wonderful having a book like this when I teach classes on discursive design. I've never, ever had a single book that has been a foundation for me in a class. It's always just, here's the reading list. And with this, because there are so many references in the book that we're getting other students are getting other perspectives in there, but I'm able to use like this one book as the core of what I teach. So that's really refreshing and sort of wonderful to do that and to know very intimately every word that's in here. And know how it can be used and where it's valuable for students, and actually increasingly learn and where it's working and not working in different ways, and how I might have to take this content and spin it or discuss it from a little bit of a different perspective, because for certain types of designers, it resonates or not. Because I get designers who are coming from engineering, and also ones that are more from the art side as well in my current teaching. So their approaches are very different. So I'm learning how to use the book to address those different perspectives, and also the different goals and agendas that people might have in coming to a class.
My last question, this is a question that I use to end all of these conversations. And you've mentioned a couple kind of people throughout this conversation, but I'm curious if there are books or authors or theorists who have really kind of influenced how you think about all of this, that, someone's listening to this, they pick up Discursive Design. What are the other books that they should be getting alongside yours?
I think there are like 4 other key books, if I were to look at that. And I think there are actually going to be more. If looking at sort of the trajectory of this field and some of the growth that we see in PhD programs, and like I mentioned, the influence of strategic foresight, that I think we're going to see a bit of a flurry of books in the next few years. But right now, for me, I think Hertzian Tales is certainly for me where it all starts. So with Anthony Dunn's work that he did at the RCA, so incredibly seminal and just understate the impact that has had in this arena. And then I look at Carl DeSalvo's book Adversarial Design, which is what I mentioned before, which begins to put this in I would say maybe even in a more responsible perspective or light, and really begin to thinking about how this stuff is disseminated. And then I think Speculative Everything is very important as well, and certainly very popular. And then I think lastly, Matthew Malpass's A Critical Design in Context, which came out last year in
Oh, I don't know that one.
Yeah. So he does a really sort of a great job of conceptualizing the field of critical design, and so I've met Matt, before actually when he was working on his dissertation, we've been working on this book for so long. It's kind of funny the number of people that Stuart Candy like, oh, you're working on a book,
Right.
and I was like, that was 10 years ago. But yeah, when Matt had approached us when he was working on his work, and we went on his dissertation, and there was clearly we were struggling with the same issues, and so it's really nice to sort of see his book and how he approaches it. It's very much more like a piece of in design studies, more so than ours, which we think of ours as a little bit more of a textbook. It would really focus on how do you do, we want to give tools for designers to do this kind of work. So I think those 4 books are ones that I would, that I think are pretty fundamental, seminal. And also I think that for, this is sort of my list of 3 books of non-design books for designers that I really like. The first is a book called Bad Science.
And I don't know this.
Yeah.
One.
So it comes. I forget the author now. Apologize. But he writes news. He's a medical doctor who does a lot of writing, popular writing, and really about science and media and how the media uses statistics. And it's really, I think, very helpful and eye-opening as a designer, but also as just a consumer, and how science is often used in different and not so great ways. And so I also use it to help designers open up their minds a little bit to science and other fields, and how they begin to think and approach the world. So Bad Science. The other one is Influence, and that's by Robert Cialdini, and that's a little bit of a classic in its area. And so it's I think it's the subtitle, and it's got a little bit of a cheesy subtitle. I'm sure that the publisher put on the power of persuasion, right?
I know this.
It's kind of a classic now, but it's really looking at how, because designers are so often we're in this sort of behavior change space, right? That we're working in increasingly working in more complex problem spaces, and we're trying to oftentimes encourage people to do things a little bit differently, to have more preferred outcomes. So Influence is one of those books, and the last one is Made to Stick. Again, another sort of popular. Well-known book, but really, and this is also where it can be relative, I think, to discursive design, although I talk about it for any of the designers, right? It's largely about communication and how to make your ideas, your design, or the ideas embedded or embodied in those designs, how to make them stick, and how to make them connect with people. And this is, again, one of the, if we think about the sort of second wave, maybe, if you want to call it that, in this discursive design arena, where we begin to start to focus a little bit more on the assembly of publics and shift to a little bit more audience-centeredness. This made to stick, and these ideas are incredibly important if you want to impact the way people think and remember your work. It's there. But I talk about also is you want to be a good parent, like it's there. And so those are my 3 non-design books for designers.
I love that. That was such a great list, both the design books and the non-design books. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I really enjoyed the book. I'm really glad we got to have this conversation. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
It's really my pleasure. I mean, one of the things is we didn't spend all this time on the book for it to sit on the shelf, right? We really want people to engage with it, and it's helpful to begin to give a little bit of an entree to the book for people. So thank you very much.
This episode was recorded on March 15th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.